Hello, Big Smoke listeners. Today's episode is a deep dive into the historical events that underpin some of the challenges we face today. It's not a commentary on current affairs, but rather a way to explore how the past has shaped the present. Our conversations on the Big Smoke are designed to sit outside the fast-moving news cycle, yet history inevitably finds its way into the headlines. We recorded our interview with Jonn on June 12th, 2025. And this episode is being released on June 26th, 2025. In under 2 weeks, the world has changed again. A tragic Air India crash claimed over 200 lives. Riots erupted across Northern Ireland. Leaders gathered at the G7 summit in Canada, grappling with growing tensions. And a major escalation between Iran, Israel, and the US has stunned the global community. All of this comes on top of ongoing conflicts and humanitarian crises around the world. Some parts of this conversation may now resonate differently, or feel oddly timed given how fast the news moves. We can't predict what will be weighing on your mind or on the world when you press play, but we hope this conversation offers some grounding in the bigger picture. This episode also includes an opportunity to clear the mind with some poignant poetry and the return of a fan-favorite segment. So, mind the gap, and let's hop off the underground. You surface from the underground at Piccadilly Circus.
Mind the gap.
Making your way through the glittering lights of London's West End, you take a turn down a quaint-looking street into the notorious neighborhood of Soho. The lights are up, the crowd is buzzing, and you just stepped into the best seat in the house. Welcome to The Big Smoke, a variety show podcast. I'm Kevin Bennett, and I'll be your guide through this experience of comedy, conversation, and community. This week on The Big Smoke, we're examining borders, breaking habits, and finding stillness in headlines, in neuroscience, and in verse. First, I sit down with political journalist and best-selling author Jonn Elledge to talk about how history, power, and a few suspiciously straight lines still shape our world today. Then, in our Parish Notices, we step outside and ask, how do you unplug? We explore practical and tangible ways to digitally disconnect. After that, it's time to plug back in to yourself with Archie's Neuro Nuggets and this week's insight into the science of sensing your own body. And finally, we have the return of poet Nehassaiu deGannes with some powerful poetry to dance its way through your ears and into your soul. But first, let's pop into the local for a quick pub quiz. This round, Maple Leaf or Make Believe? Here's how the game works. I will read out 3 different Canadian news headlines. One of these headlines is the real thing, Maple Leaf. The rest, make believe. Can you figure out which one is real? Here are the headlines. Headline number 1, from The Telegram in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. Newfoundland man suspended from curling league for using Roomba to sweep. It kept changing directions, said teammates, but the ice has never been cleaner. Headline number 2 from Global News Radio 640 in Toronto, Ontario. Residents petition to add A to the national anthem. Proposed new line reads, "O Canada, we stand on guard for thee, eh?" Headline number 3 from CBC News National. Moosehead's crate of 1,461 beers, one a day for Trump's term, sells out within days. The presidential pack, enough beer to make it through the Trump presidency. Think you know which one's the real Maple Leaf? You'll find out at the end of the episode. It's time to welcome our first guest. He's a journalist and author of 3 books, including the international bestseller, A History of the World in 47 Borders. Please welcome Jonn Elledge.
Thank you for having me. It's always nice to be, well, anyway, really. I just like the sound of my own voice, so it's always nice to be asked.
Well, this is an opportunity for yourself and many people to hear the sound of your voice. So you're a political journalist and an author. Is that how you would describe yourself if someone at a cocktail party said, "Who are you? What do you do?"
It would probably start with to be honest. I don't really know what I am anymore.
Start with a long Is that what you said?
Yeah, I mean, I make my living writing, which is writing things that are broadly true.
Was politics always an avenue you were interested in? Because it seems to be a major focus of the writing that you do. Or was that something that came later or you kind of stumbled into?
So I feel like a bit of a cheat describing myself as a political journalist because I've never been in the lobby, which is the weird institution whereby you get like a parliamentary pass and you get to sort of wander around and buttonhole ministers and so on when they're
and that's like an official thing you have to get
That
into.
is, yeah. It's a bit closed shop. And I've never been like a political editor or anything, but I've always written about stuff sort of on the edge of politics. I've written a lot about public policy. I've written about things like housing and transport and education and the healthcare service.
So did you always read about this kind of stuff? Like what got you interested in this? Or was your household growing up very political or having discussions about these types of things?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, one of my earliest political memories must have been a family do Easter 1992 and we were just in the run-up to an election. And I just remember, this is the whole extended family, like my dad's side of my family. And I just remember a massive blazing row breaking out about who everyone wanted to win the upcoming election. And it was kind of like, it was just one of those families that would kind of communicate by having those kind of arguments, which is fun. But I didn't really know much about what was going on then. But yeah, like I sort of came of age just before Tony Blair got elected for the first time. So I was sort of properly paying attention to the news for the first time in sort of the run up to that election. It's like, well, the country's rubbish. Like, there must be something better than this.
So that big row that happened with your family, did that make you, because to me, I feel like that would make me kind of shy away from that topic. But was it kind of exciting or did it spark something like when those big rows happened, did they just kind of like a water off a duck's back settle or did it cause actual tension? Because nowadays I feel like with politics, I'm Canadian, you're from the UK. Were you born and raised in London?
Yeah, pretty much.
So London, Canada, I mean, I obviously am very aware of, I try to keep up to speed on global politics and American politics, but it just seems now like if someone has different political views to you, that's like, I'm going to ghost you.
It has become hard. So like my dad died a few years ago. And I wrote a column about the experience of bereavement and about how, like, we'd communicated by arguing about politics, but that had kind of been screwed over by Brexit, by the referendum, because, like, normally, like, we'd be able to, like, have a few pints and kind of, like, go a few rounds, but it was like, that was how we talked, and the referendum kind of broke that because we were too far apart because, like, and I think it also didn't help that, like, I was used to the dynamic being that, like, he was really angry about all the terrible people he thought were screwing up the world, and I could be kind of like, oh, bless you, old man. Like, that's a slightly indulgent thing. And the problem with the Brexit one was that I lost. And I was furious about it. And he kept going, you over it yet? It's like, no, I'm bloody not. No, and it did kind of like, I mean, like, it's not like we stopped talking or anything, but it did make it harder because, like, we just learned to communicate by, like, having a row about Gordon Brown's tax policies or something. But this was too fundamental. And I kind of think the Brexit referendum was kind of an early harbinger of, well, I suppose it came after the Scottish independence referendum that had a similar vibe.
What year was that?
That was 2014. That was that was September 14. But it was just pre-Trump. I imagine that the recent Canadian election probably kind of had that vibe where, like, it did kind of feel like it was sort of existential for people, right? Like, and if you were one of the people voting for the Conservatives, then you were probably, like, horrified by the sense that, like, so much of the country was kind of like rallying the Canadian national identity behind the other side.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I first came, so I've been living in London or in the UK for about 7-8 years, but I've been working here for 10. And was the Brexit referendum in 2015, am I right in saying that?
2016.
Or 16. So it was nice. So I hadn't moved here yet, but it was my second year. I was working on a play that was about to go from here and tour all around the world. And I didn't know much about it because at that point, No, I'm in my 20s. I was really self-centered as an artist that was trying to make it, and all I really cared about was putting on shows and all those things. So I'd heard about it, but I hadn't formed much of an opinion, and also I hadn't lived here yet. But it happened around May, June, I think.
June 23rd.
Okay, so I was
burned into my memory.
Well, I was in rehearsals, and I'll tell you, the tone changed that day in rehearsals. But it was a very surreal experience to be slightly on the outside of it, but in this space, trying to get to know people who've had this massive thing happen.
I mean, it was weird, and I think, like, on the Remain side, on the losing side, I think a lot of people didn't realize how strongly they felt. I mean, there almost certainly are people who didn't turn out to vote and who later regretted that because, like, they found it devastating. And I think, like, these things that are actually, it's not just a policy change, it's rooted in identity and who you think you are and what your country is. I think that does kind of speak to kind of a deeper level with this stuff. And I think that's where a lot of politics has gone the last few years. And I definitely think, like, we've seen that with the Trump stuff in the US. And that's definitely the vibe I got because Mark Carney's Liberals were so sort of like, I don't know what you'd say, like rallying around the maple leaf, something like that. But like it was so, the elbows up thing. So like, if you're a proper Canadian, you're going to vote Liberal because we're going to show
that
Trump.
That was
And if you were someone of like, conservative views, that must have been quite alienating, I imagine.
Well, actually, okay, so this leads to my sort of first official hard-hitting question, but it's really, we're almost halfway through the year. In a few weeks, once the time of this being recorded.
I haven't written enough of a book.
Well, here's the thing. So at the start of the year, you posed a question in a New Statesman article, which is 2025 the year I finally quit politics? At the end of the piece, you used a quote or an alleged quote by Leon Trotsky that says, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you, which you then follow up by saying, the same I fear is true of 2025. It's going to be a bumpy ride. So, okay, it's been a bumpy ride to say the least, I'm sure some would say. Did this year finally make you quit writing about politics and being involved in politics? And what led you to write that piece in the first place?
Well, I mean, like... So I've been writing something for the New Statesman every week for nigh on 12 years now, which is a long time. And, for nearly 6 of those, I was on staff, but I was doing it a bit before I joined the staff, and I've been doing it for 5 years since. So to some extent, like, there's just a constant, like, I need something I can write 800 words on. But that was something I was feeling very, very powerfully at that point. I have been, for the first time in my... Really, since I was about 15, 16, I have been getting this urge to kind of look away. And this is another reason I was a bit reluctant to describe myself as a political journalist, actually. Because, like, enough of my career these days is wrapped up in things that are not directly writing about the news. I have a weekly newsletter on Substack where I kind of write whatever nerdy nonsense I like. It's just the contents of my brain, and for some reason people pay for it. I write books, and they're kind of like, there's often, politics is in there, but it's not about what's happening on our TV screens right now. And it's horrible out there. Like, we're seeing, the climate crisis is not a thing that's happening in future anymore. It's happening right now. The US is slipping into, I mean, it's no longer an exaggeration to say it is slipping into something that resembles fascism. We have the Labour government in the UK, which I've been, I've had a really hard time the last few years for reasons I'm not going to go into. But like, really, like, there have been times where I could have wanted to check out. And one of the things that kept me going was I wanted to see the Conservative Party lose that election. I wanted to be here to watch them defeated. So I've been looking forward to this Labour government, and it's been a terrible disappointment. Partly because they have such a difficult inheritance. Like, I don't envy them. And the economy is in a mess, and that. But like, also, even given those constraints, I don't feel they're doing brilliantly. And so just like, it's where are we meant to get hope from at this point? It doesn't kind of feel like there's any positive stuff on the horizon. And even like kind of, 10 years ago, at least you could kind of disappear into this utopianism of like, big tech was still doing interesting things, or there was a lot of interesting stuff in culture. And it's like, well, now those two things are screwing each other up. And, like, it just doesn't feel like there's a nice place to look at the moment. One of the reasons I got I found myself following the Canadian election so closely and the Australian one a couple of weeks later is because it's like, well, this is something I can enjoy. I can actually
Not
like
so personal, not so like
yeah. And I got in the run up to Britain's election last year when the Conservatives were clearly on course for a historic defeat. I got a bit too into reading about the 1993 Canadian election, which is the one where the Progressive Conservatives went from being in majority government, to losing all but 2 seats, and the party leader lost her seat.
Oh, I see.
And it was just it's one of the few examples on record of a party of government in a democratic Western country being wiped out at an election. And the party basically died and merged with another rival on the right. And that was like, well, I'd like to see that happen here. So I got a bit too into learning about that. So I kind of just know more about Canadian politics than even the average political.
Well, you probably
Brit.
know more than me. I mean, so suffice it to say, you haven't completely turned your back on it based on that.
No, I mean, I still have to write a column every week. It's not always about politics.
So you can't turn away completely.
Yeah, and I'm a regular on a politics podcast called Oh God, What Now? And it is still. There's 30% of my job that is unavoidably political, so I can't switch it off. But I wrote that piece you quoted as therapy because for the first time I genuinely was like, I would like to, if I could. I would really like to switch off from politics at this point. And I've never felt that before.
Well, this kind of
it's what I have instead of sport,
And it goes back to the conversations with your dad. It's like the thing that links you to other people, the thing you can have dialogue over. I mean, I have felt that way with my own industry at times because when you work in an industry, for me, it has been theater for so long. It's all enveloping. It's my passion. It's my hobby as well as my job, and it's as well as my friends and relationships. And if you ever want to take a break or have some distance from that, that's difficult because it's your full life. But that actually leads me to, so one of the main reasons I was really interested in talking to you is because for me personally, I've always felt, I try to be responsible and aware of the news, and I kind of it's hard not to look at American news, but I watch The View, which I love in my entertainment, but kind of keeps me informed. And, I'll scroll through CNN and things, and then I look at British news and Canadian news, but I don't feel particularly, if I'm honest, confident talking about my opinions. And I don't mean like in this forum or in a public forum, but I even mean with friends kind of sharing a strong opinion about a political view, whatever that might be, or about something that's happening in the world. And I think that comes from my desire to know probably more than is possible in a way. Like I want to know all the facts, and I want to know where it came from and why that's happened and what's the history of it. And it almost feels like I scratched the surface on that, and then there's just the well is too deep. There's too far to go. So I wanted to chat.
It's like tuning into a soap opera that's been running for 20 years.
Exactly.
There's too much backstory.
And I'm like, I got to watch, there's 5 shows a week for 20 years. Oh my gosh, there's too much backstory. So I'd love to talk to you a bit and ask you to talk me through one or two of these maybe principles and where they come from. So I'm going to start by asking you perhaps what might be quite a broad question, but let's see how it goes. So in your view, if there were a kind of 3 or 4 main historical political concepts that you think have influenced all the different things going on in the world today politically, all the issues, whatever those are, what would they be? What would you say they were?
Oh God, that is a big question.
I'm thinking, is it the creation of money and the way currency is used in the world? Is it religion? Is it you've written a book about borders?
Well, yeah. Let's start there. I think like the unavoidable one is the concept of the nation state. Just those are the units in which we fundamentally do politics. And we're so the book is called A History of the World in 47 Borders, and it is kind of, it's about borders, it's about lines on maps. But to talk about that, you kind of also have to talk about, where these things we're putting the lines between came from. And it starts with an observation that if you put into a search engine the phrase map of the world, it will automatically give you a political map of the world. It will give you a map of the 194-ish countries in the world. It will divide the planet up into nearly 200 bits of territory in different colors because it assumes that's what you want. that's an assumption.
Mm-hmm.
That is not. There are other ways of mapping the world. You could show, geographical features, like rivers and mountain ranges, or you could show, population centers. There's other ways of looking at things, but it's so ingrained in all of us that, when a map of the world is a map of these nation states. And so it's kind of weird to sit back and think these things are basically they're not that old. They were invented. Any nation is invented. It's something like, I think the oldest nation state is probably Japan's up there. I mean, that's maybe 2,000 years. I mean, China, you get ones that are like empires. Well, Egypt, obviously Egypt. When we're talking about Egypt, it's like 5,000 years old. But like generally speaking, a lot of the nations we have today were inventions of, well, in Africa, they were invented after World War II in a lot of cases. But even in Europe, a lot of the nations we have now these identities emerged in the 19th century. They're quite new. And so like, this is a very long way of answering your question, but nationalism is such a huge driving force of all our politics. I mean, if you look at what's going on in the US at the moment, it's, the whole, make America great again, America first thing, that is a nationalist movement. Or even the more benign version, which we've talked about in Canada, like Mark Carney doing elbows up and so on. It's still like there is a Canadian national identity that exists in opposition to those guys south of the 49th parallel. And these things are made up. They are imagined communities that only really start emerging in a big way in the last 300 years. Before that, most of the world, you get cities and you get empires. And cities will
there weren't borders in a way? Or?
No, I mean, borders worked differently. So, like, if you go back more than a few centuries, instead of like hard lines in the way we have now, of like, here is very definitely where.
Across the street, you're now in the States or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. Historically, you'd be more likely to have kind of a center and periphery model.
Which means?
So if you think of like, there's a center of power, like, the capital, Rome, say, and then the further you get from it, the less power there is, probably.
Just like kind of watered down as it goes. Okay.
So if you think of Hadrian's Wall, the actual physical barrier across the north of England from Newcastle to Carlisle, which I grew up imagining that was the limits of Roman power.
Okay.
And it probably wasn't. It probably wasn't anything that simple. It was probably more correct to think of it as like a tripwire. So like, already in, the north of England, Roman power was a lot weaker than it was in the south, where, the south of England was as Romanized as anywhere in like France or Spain or something. The north was a bit wilder. And then, but like, there would be military missions beyond that. It was more kind of a tripwire, so that if the bunch of angry Picts are sort of heading towards the empire, you can see them coming and you can take action and you can tax them as they try and bring goods in. It kind of works more like that rather than being, you are now entering Roman territory. Here is where Roman law starts. Do you see what I mean? It's like, it's not quite the same as like, here is where Roman power ends, because it's already weak by that point and it gets projected beyond that. But it's kind of a sort of vague marker rather than a hard line as we have now. So for much of history, it would have been more like that, even on a smaller scale in like medieval Europe. What we think of as, well, there's a thing to this day called the Ile-de-France, which is the region around Paris, basically the capital region of France. And that's because, that's the historic core of France. And it was surrounded by provinces which were part of the Kingdom of France, but they were slightly less control. The king had less control over them than he did over the Ile-de-France, which was his own personal territory. So a lot of things like that. And, some of these would be sort of switched between different powers at different points.
Are there benefits to that system that you can see that compared to this hard line thing that we have now, which is essentially just all over the world? That's what it is with borders. Or is that flawed in some way?
So one of the questions people tend to ask when I've been doing events promoting the book is like, do you think borders are inevitable? And tragically, I've kind of concluded they probably are, but not necessarily in the sort of horrible nationalistic way we're seeing a lot of at the moment, more in terms of you fundamentally need to know whose laws apply and who you're paying taxes to. Like, modern civilization requires a measure of administration, and that requires territorial units. You kind of can't get around that.
So you couldn't be in that muddy zone in the middle.
I don't think like, I mean, there are a few places in the world. There's a bit of East Africa called Bertawil, which is the only bit of land outside Antarctica, which is not claimed by any nation state.
Okay.
For various complicated reasons I won't go into. And there's a few other places where like there's dotted lines on maps because, you know, it's a border for a desert or something. And like we sort of say it's here for convenience, but it's not really, you know, we don't really, it's not really marked in any way. It's a bit notional.
Right.
But generally speaking, every bit of land outside Antarctica on Earth it belongs to a nation state.
And you talk about in the book, in the beginning, I believe it's like one of the earliest borders that we know of in Egypt. Is that right? So can you tell me when that was created and essentially why?
So the story I tell in the book isn't actually about the creation of that border. It's its abolition. So sort of the earliest political event that anybody has even tried to put a date on is around probably about 3100 BC. It's the unification of ancient Egypt, which prior to that is two kingdoms up, which we call, they probably didn't call themselves this, but we call them Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. And the first pharaoh, who is sometimes called Menes and sometimes called Nama, because nothing can ever be simple. He becomes pharaoh by uniting the two, and for, you know, centuries, millennia even, like pharaoh's role is he's the guy who is strong enough to hold this disparate country together. And I wanted to start the book there partly because it is a story about a border. It's the earliest one I was aware of, but also because I think it says something that like the earliest story we have of border is of its abolition, and also it feels baffling. Like it feels meaningless now. You look at it, it's like, why were there two Egypts? And also it might not be true. And like it might be propaganda. Right.
And do we know if the border at that time, was it what you described in terms of this much more fluid thing, or was there a clear border, or we don't know?
It probably was fluid. Anything in ancient history, you're kind of reconstructing it from patchy records like king lists, which people stick on a tomb or something, or archaeology. And also, like, we know far more about Upper Egypt than Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt is actually the southern bit, because up the river, the land is drier, so things don't rot. Lower Egypt was the land of the Nile Delta. There's just less stuff that survived from 5,000 years ago. So it's all like, it's incredibly partial, the records we have. So like, I mean, there's a couple of parts in that chapter I basically had to go, also, like, you know, some Egyptologists say this might not be true. It might just be a convenient story. But nonetheless, it's the story of the abolition of a border. And I just kind of thought that was kind of a cute way of starting this book.
Well, I was thinking with my initial question about, you know, I want to know the foundation of some of the things that caused the world to be the way that it is, so that I can start to feel more confident with forming an opinion, basically, because I don't consider.
Why are you holding yourself back? So few people do.
Well, I don't know. We live in this divided world. Everybody gets so riled up. I've never, you know, my family didn't really discuss politics, so it wasn't something that was really in my life. And so I've always felt there's if I'm totally open about it, there's just always been a part of me that's been, I must not know enough. You know, obviously I read the news, I vote, I do all the things that I'm supposed to do, but it's, you know, I see so many people in my life posting things and talking about things, and I always feel, maybe it's the Canadian in me. I don't know. I'm just always like, I can't share So I guess my question is, in terms of the concept of nation states and borders, you know, either through examples or just in general, how can I use the understanding of that to help me understand some of the things that are going on today? I mean, there's some obvious examples, but
the reason I think it's relevant is because, you know, nationalism has been this huge force in politics for a couple of centuries, really. It kind of really gets going in a big way in like the 1840s. It sort of comes out of Central Europe, where you've got what become Germany and Italy are kind of at that point fragmented. They're lots of little states, and it's about the process of unifying them. It's about the end of the slow end of the Habsburg and Ottoman empires, which are these kind of multinational, as we see them now, entities with like lots of different ethnic and language groups in there. And nationalism at that point is seen as a progressive force. It's something that's kind of pushing back against these old empires, these kind of decaying dynasties. But it's like, I think it's worthwhile remembering that these are imagined communities that have often not existed very long. So to what extent is it really worth basing your entire identity on them? Like, is it worth actually dying for these things? Well, I mean, like one of the things that I think was so sort of fascinating. I keep talking about the Canadian election again, sorry. But one of the things I think was so fascinating about that is, like, it sort of became clear that it wasn't just Donald Trump there are quite a lot of Americans, even on the kind of liberal, slightly lefty side, who kind of don't really believe Canada's a proper country in the way they are.
Well, this
right?
brings me to, I was gonna say, so I've read the chapter on Canada in your book, and also you wrote an article recently, again in the New Statesman, which was titled "What Donald Trump Gets Right About the Canadian Border,"
which I thought would get me into far more trouble than it did.
It's a very flashy title, but I read the article, and in it you say, or no, maybe this is from the book. The presence of a straight line on a map instead tells you when and how a line was drawn, and likely by who.
Generally speaking, if there's a very long straight line on the map, it was some Europeans doing it a long way away.
I thought there was a connection to that because obviously that's a huge part of the Canada-US border. So tell me about that.
Donald Trump was kind of pointing to this on the map and saying it's a ridiculous border. Like, it's just a straight line. That's an insane border. And he's not entirely wrong. Like, it was the result of treaties agreed between the newborn United States and what was then British North America, which becomes Canada. And it was, a bunch of colonialists, imperialists, however you want to discuss them, dividing up land that had been inhabited by other peoples for millennia. And often they'd not visited these places, which is why it's a straight line. It's just, we'll put it here. It pays no attention to geographical features. It's exactly the same process we see half a century later in the Scramble for Africa, which happened in a conference room in Berlin without a single African in the room. It's an insane process. Donald Trump was right about that. But he wasn't right in saying that it's therefore unusual or illegitimate, because the important thing is the people on the other side of that line from him do not think they're American. They do have no intention of becoming American. And this is why they just, the liberals just won in a landslide, right?
Yeah. Well, okay, so this is interesting because you mention in the book an area that's very close to where I grew up, which is Point Roberts, which is like this little sort of
British Columbia.
Yeah, in British Columbia. So I grew up near Vancouver, and there's a little bit, what would you call it? Like, it's like a little finger.
Peninsula,
that's the word, that sticks out, surrounded by the Pacific Ocean, that is below the 49th parallel border. Yeah. So if you go into Point Roberts, that's America.
It's a suburb of Vancouver. Like, it is physically contiguous with Vancouver, but you have to cross an international border to get there, which didn't seem to bother anyone that much until March 2020 rolled around.
Yeah, it must cost a lot of unnecessary money because every time they want to get stuff, unless they fly it there or by boat, they have to drive around.
In practice, you probably, most of the time, it doesn't matter.
Because it's a very small area.
I think most of the time the people in Point Roberts, they're Americans, but they functionally exist as part of the community in Vancouver, right? Yeah. But that's become more difficult because this incredibly sort of open, largely notional border has suddenly become massively politicized because the guy in the White House is going, well, that's going to be the 51st state.
Well, I wonder if people in Point Roberts feel kind of trapped and isolated now.
They must feel on the front line.
They must. Well, the other thing I was thinking, and I don't know if you went into this when you were studying that border, but what's interesting is because the straight line sort of begins, I think, around Manitoba and then goes west. And but then when you get and goes right across Point Roberts, as if they were just drawing a line on a map and not paying attention.
Yeah, but that's exactly what they were doing. So,
but then my question is, Vancouver Island dips down, which has Victoria, which is the capital of British Columbia. So were there some contingencies at the time where they went, we must go down and around?
It's just treaties. It's just on piecemeal. It's path dependency. So there's also a couple of thousand miles away, probably from Point Roberts, there's a bit called the Northwest Angle, which is, physically, it's attached to, I can't remember which state it is, probably on province, or it's probably Ontario at that point, I think, but I'm not sure. It's attached, it's physically attached to Canada, but because of the way a treaty was drawn up, it's legally America, and it's not attached to the rest of America. To get from there to the rest of America, you have to either go through Canada or get on a boat. But that is what the treaty said in 1783. It's never been renegotiated, and so American it remains. There's loads of this stuff all over the world. And actually, until between 1812 and 2025, none of this mattered because, America and Canada were basically, friendly. But it's only recently that suddenly it started to feel like a real border again.
In the research for this book, were there borders that you came across that you thought this didn't make any sense? Like, why did they, other than some of the stuff we were just talking about, but I just mean wow, that seems completely illogical. I mean, maybe the scramble for Africa that you're talking about or that sort of still cause I guess, confusion? I mean, there's lots of disruption in the world from these things.
I mean, so many of them. It's one of the big themes of the book. So, I mean, one of the ones that probably the single line on a map that's caused the most, that had the highest death toll, I think probably is the partition of India in 1947. Which is one of those stories from which, in some ways, it's quite refreshing. If you write a book like this, it is just like, oh, would you believe it? It's the bloody British again. It's not always the British. Sometimes it's the French or the Spanish or the Portuguese, but it is often the British. One of the things that was kind of unusual about the partition of India is like nobody comes out of it well. Like neither of the communities in what had been British India cover themselves in glory in that one. There's a lot of ethnic cleansing. And basically, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who's the leader of the All India Muslim League, has been watching what's been happening to the Jews in Europe. And he's gone from thinking, well, like, you know, we can just have one multicultural India to thinking, actually, I want there to be a Muslim homeland so that there's somewhere safe, basically. And so that becomes Pakistan, which at that point is there's two bits of land 1,000 miles apart because Bangladesh is East Pakistan and then later declared its independence.
So when is this again?
This is 1947.
47.
And it's incredible. Like most of the I can't remember if the states or provinces at that point, but most of the bits of India are very obviously either mostly going to be mostly Hindu and Sikh, so they can go in what becomes India, or mostly Muslim, so they can go in what becomes Pakistan. There are two, which are Punjab in the west and Bengal in the east, which are kind of very, you know, they're split down the middle. Like Bengal is like Calcutta is a largely Hindu city in a largely Muslim area. I think it's that way around. And these places are just impossible to you know, physically divide up. So what happens is you get, well, firstly, the British send in, they can't get a high court judge to do it. So it's a barrister who's sent in to work with two guys from the Muslim side, two guys from the Hindu side to kind of divide India. But the problem is those guys are, because there's two from either side, they're deadlocked. This guy, who's never previously been east of Paris, has to just kind of make a decision as to where he puts it. And he writes to his son-in-law going like, I want to be out of the country before this line is unveiled because 80 million people are going to be out for my blood. And he does do that. He gets out of the country, never visit again. Once the path of the line is announced, literally millions of people find themselves on the wrong side. And there's ethnic cleansing. There's murder. People die. Lots of people die. Millions are displaced, but I think hundreds of thousands die. People are killing their neighbours because they're suddenly the wrong side of a line on a map. That feels like a pretty stupid thing to do.
Do you think in our lifetimes there's any borders that are going to go away?
Yeah, of course.
And can you make any predictions? Or do you think that, you know, because we live in this time where it's like we've been talking about, so Donald Trump's talking about the Canadian border. Obviously, every Canadian's like, that's never going to happen. But then you talked about the India-Pakistan.
The most recent. So, like, another thing about that story is like, if you grow up with a country on the map, you sort of assume it's natural, right?
Well, it's the Google search of the map. I hadn't even thought that there wouldn't be borders on the map. Like, that's how you look at a map. In my view.
Growing up, it never occurred to me that Bangladesh was only 9 years older than I am.
Wow,
but that's true. The newest country on earth is South Sudan, I think, which is 2011. Okay. So that's pretty recent. The most recent change in border I'm aware of, there might have been more recent, but the most recent I'm aware of is early 2022. It's your own home country again, finally agreed its international border with Denmark through, are you aware of the story of the Whiskey War?
No.
So this one didn't make the book. I wrote it up as a blog for the bookshop Waterstones to promote it earlier this year. But it's like, there's this uninhabited island between Greenland and Canada. And when Canada and Denmark were setting their international border, they both wanted this island. So there was a very nice thing called the conflict called the Whiskey War, where for 50 years, one of them would show up, plant a flag, leave a bottle of booze.
Okay. I think I heard about this.
Yeah, and then, like, you know, it was very well-meaning and friendly because, you know, they're both, you know, they're allied countries. They're both in NATO. So, like, you know, it was a disputed border, but, like, no one was going to do anything silly.
Right.
It was kind of a running joke. But in the early months of 2022, when everyone knew Russia was going to walk into Ukraine, and it suddenly became important that NATO was on one side, of one mind about things, those two countries decided to kind of settle their differences and actually just agree. What they really could have done 50 years earlier was like, we'll just put the line down the middle of the island. But that is a border that exists now and didn't exist 4 years ago.
You know, it's interesting. Everything that you brought up, that you just mentioned, Russia and Ukraine, I just feel like, yeah, maybe if going back to my sort of desire to, I got to know a bit more of the history and the roots. I feel like in order to form opinions and feel more confident with my understanding of global political events, it seems like borders are a big part of it.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I mean, but it's constant. Everything is constantly changing. And we sometimes imagine things are a lot more eternal than they are. Like, so another of the reasons I think I find it interesting is because having grown up on an island, you have this idea that nation states are kind of, physical units and are inevitable. And I was quite old before I realized, when the borders of the UK, as it exists now, were settled?
No.
1922.
Oh, wow. Do you mean the borders of like England to Wales and
no? Sorry, I mean like that's a different. I mean like where the UK stops and something else begins.
Oh, okay.
Because between 1801 and 1922, the whole of Ireland is part of the UK.
Right.
And 1922 is when we sort of. I mean, it's a process, but 1922 is the sort of the official date at which 26 counties of Ireland become independent. And it's just like I think we kind of talk about this as if it's like this incredibly old country. We project it back onto England as well. England has existed in some form since the early 10th century. It's like 1100 years old. But the UK has existed since 1707, and the UK in its current form has existed since 1922. That's much more recent, and this is an old country. There are countries you think of as like Germany, 1870.
Wow.
Italy's 1859, I think. There's a lot, there's also Russia, 1991. I mean, there was a Russia before, but it's not the Russia we have now.
Well, yeah, you have this great quote that I just want to read for people from the book, talking about the sort of fluidity and the inevitability of these things. No border is inevitable or eternal. They are arbitrary and contingent, and in many cases could have looked very different if a war or treaty or the decisions of a handful of Europeans had gone a different way, which is sort of all-encompassing what you're talking about. I wanted to ask you one more question, which is, how do you recommend people stay informed in a way that they can be productive? Because the reason I ask this question is there's a lot of people that I know that will justify their, let's say, doom scrolling on Instagram or whatever you want to call it by I'm being informed, I'm keeping up to date. But then I see the effect on their mental health is so low because they're seeing the effects of the wars and all the different things going on constantly.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like a healthy, productive way. So I guess, and also in the world of fake news, and there's so many different outlets where you can get information, how would you recommend someone stay engaged, whether that's certain outlets, or do you have methods in order to do it in a productive way?
Not good ones. I mean, I read a piece about this in my Substack last week as we spoke. So I read it early June because I had been thinking about this, because I do feel like the world has got smaller. Like even in the 90s or the noughties, like, we were aware of horrible things happening, but they felt they were over there. There were bad headlines in the news. Like I remember, like there are names in my head like Aleppo or Sarajevo, which like I know I don't know that much about them as places, but they've become like events, if you know what I mean. It's the site of something horrible atrocity, but they're distanced from us. And I think something that is new in this current era we're living in now is we can hear the voices from those places. Like someone in Gaza or Kyiv can like literally message you and go, they're killing us, help us.
Yeah.
And
you can swipe from your friend's birthday party on Instagram to that, a picture of that. So it also feels very personal.
Yeah. And I don't have an answer. I mean, the other thing I find is for a long time, I sort of felt like I knew what was going on just by sort of ambiently existing on the internet. Like I was on Twitter. I was very on Twitter. But you would pick up the day's big news stories just from being there. Yeah. And Twitter is gone. And, I like Blue Sky, which is the sort of best thing that's popped up to replace it, I think. But it's not the same. And I don't have that anymore. I have to now go out and search for the news. I have to put the radio on to hear what the headlines are. I have to check the front page of the BBC or the Guardian. I'm not answering your question because I don't know.
Well, so, I mean, part of it is, so you look at the BBC, you look at the Guardian. Maybe
there's nowhere that you can completely, there's never going to make you angry.
Bias
you can completely
or
trust.
anything like that.
I mean, all I can say is maybe try and have a bit of a varied media diet and switch off, read fiction.
Yeah, control when it is you go on.
Yeah.
I think if you take in your news, I mean, what I would say probably is if you take it in on the same platforms that you take in all the other stuff, that might be the dangerous thing. Because then it's all mixed in and you don't have control of when you choose to take it in and when you don't.
Exactly, yeah. I think you do need to, I mean, I think like the thing I was saying about how we can hear voices from these places where horrific things are happening. I think that's made life, it means we kind of feel sometimes that we need to take the weight of the whole world onto us. And it's not realistic to expect to be able to kind of like think of the pain and the torment going in every corner of the world and continue to function. I think you do need to be able to go, this is awful. This is a crime against humanity, but I'm going to go for dinner. You know, I think you need to live your life.
Well, and there's going to be things like this that are, if you're looking, there's going to be something.
There is always something. Yeah. There are other atrocities that don't have the attention that we're giving to those two. I mean, like there's awful things happening in Sudan or Myanmar, and we don't hear so much about those. Or what's it like on some measures, like the Chinese state is committing the biggest genocide in decades of the Uyghurs in Western China. Yeah. We don't talk about that because that's a bit more distance from us. But I just don't think it's realistic to kind of like there's that awful quote from Neville Chamberlain in 1938 where like he's just basically sold Czechoslovakia out to the Nazis, and he described it as, you know, an allied country. He described it as, you know, a quarrel in a faraway land between people of whom we know little. And you know that he's been damned by history for that for very good reasons. But also at that point, Czechoslovakia was a long way away. It was something that wasn't directly affecting people in this country, and something has shifted. And now we kind of feel like we hear the voices from Gaza or Kiev or wherever else. And I don't think we can necessarily feel their pain in the way we would our own family or neighbours. And I think it's unrealistic to expect us to. But I think you just have to switch off. Yeah. Okay. I want to end on a slightly lighter note. Lighter than genocide.
I mean, mad? How could we possibly do that? So I've got the powers that be behind the scenes on our producing team of The Big Smoke have come up with a little true and false quiz that you might indulge us in. Okay. 3 questions, true or false. I've been told they sort of get more difficult, but we'll see. So true or false? In the UK general election in 2024, an AI-generated candidate ran for MP.
Oh, there were definitely stories about this. It was Reform. It was a young guy for Reform. I don't know. I don't recall seeing anything confirming whether it was actually AI or just a bad Photoshop. I'm going to go true.
You are correct. It is true. AI, his or their name was Steve Endicott. They ran as an independent, claiming that he would be the only MP who could have a conversation with 45,000 constituents at the same time.
Oh, this is a completely different story. I didn't hear about that at all.
Okay. Well, there you go. All right. Let's see about question number 2. A Swedish minister had such a phobia of apples that they had their staff ban them from any and all meeting rooms.
That sounds true to me.
It is false, but it's a bit of a trick question.
Is it bananas or something?
Yes, it's bananas. So the gender equality minister, Paulina Brandberg, suffers from banana phobia, which is apparently a real term, and has said she is seeking professional help, and we wish her all the best in that. Question number 3. Do you have any phobias like banana phobia?
That's
not question 3, but
I'm disproportionately frightened of wasps, given I've been stung by them on several occasions.
To me, I mean, I don't want to discredit her fear of bananas, but I feel like wasps can hurt you. Maybe she's
my dog has a terrible phobia of flies.
Well, you know what? Maybe she's allergic to bananas, so I'm not going to judge. That would make you fearful. Maybe her throat closes up if she...
Yeah, that's a fair point.
Question number 3, true or false? The mayor's office in Plettenberg, Germany, banned all cactuses from municipal buildings. The mayor's office in Plettenberg, Germany, banned all cactuses from municipal buildings. True or false?
I'm going true.
That is indeed true. After a staff member injured themselves on one of the plants, Mayor Ulrich Schult wrote, "Due to the current situation, all official and private cacti must be removed from municipal buildings immediately."
I mean, you wouldn't want to get sued, would you? I think it's probably just like, it's not worth the hassle. You can have your cacti in your own time, but when you're on government property.
So what did you get? First one you said.
I think I got two out of 3.
You got
I'll take that.
2 out of 3. That's
Yeah.
very good. Well, thank you so much for joining us on The Big Smoke. It was lovely chatting with you.
Thank you very much for having me.
And I'll just say for our listeners, I know you said it earlier, your book is A History of the World in 47 Borders by Jonn Elledge. You can find that wherever you find books. Is it around the world now as well?
It's been published in all sorts, but I actually got word today we've just sold it in Taiwan. So that's
amazing.
lovely, yeah.
So there's translations and copies
Yeah.
wherever you are listening in the world. Pick it up. I think it's a really good foundation for what I talked about in the beginning, which was maybe feeling a bit more secure in our understanding of why things are happening or how things work in the world. So, yeah.
Well, it's a good book to dip into. It's lots of short chapters. And
Yeah,
you
exactly.
don't have to read them all in order. So I hope
Pick
you
a
enjoy
border
it.
that
Yeah.
you're particularly interested in or connected to and maybe start there. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
When the bells ring out across the Big Smoke, it's time to wander out into the community for a much-needed dose of connection for this week's Parish Notices. Today, we're asking, how do you unplug? Whether it's deleting apps, escaping to nature, or attending an offline club, it seems more and more people are looking for ways to disconnect from their devices and reconnect with themselves. In The Guardian, Rick Samader chronicled his attempt to limit himself to 90 minutes of phone use per day. He shared a moment of real insight. When I notice that weight in my hand, the pull towards distraction and escape, I try to diagnose what's really going on with me. Am I worried about something? Am I lonely? What would be a better way to meet my needs? If I'm simply bored, I'm learning to trust that there's a creativity hidden in that place. That reflection captures the core of unplugging, noticing the impulse, figuring out why it's there, and learning to trust the creative space behind boredom. In Business Insider, journalist Khaled Javed went on a phone-free trek through northeast India with no GPS or messaging apps. He writes, I was lost alone and utterly dependent on strangers and a paper map. Soon, though, the locals became my unexpected compass. An older woman brewing tea over a fire gestured for me to sit with her. As steam curled from the clay cup, she traced a route on my map with charcoal-stained fingers. Follow the red prayer flags, then the goats. Her directions were vague, yet effective. By sunset, I'd traded algorithmic certainty for human intuition and found my guest house. And here in London, the Economic Times covered a growing phenomenon called the offline club. At one of their events, over 150 people paid around £10 each to hand in their phones for 2 hours and take part in a guided tech-free hangout. As organizer Ben Hounsel put it, a lot of people are realizing that just getting away from your phone for a few hours can be super beneficial in a number of ways. Offline club events are now expanding beyond London to Paris, Barcelona, and Dubai, tapping into a wider demand for face-to-face connection and digital boundaries. Are there any offline events near you? Check out the links in our show notes to learn more. Of course, we wanted to hear how our own community unplugs. So here are a few messages from our Big Smoke friends sharing what works for them.
Hi, I'm Kieran from London, and I unplug by going for a lovely stroll in the great outdoors. Whether it's at the weekend in my local park or on my lunch break during a busy shift, being outside surrounded by trees and green spaces is the perfect way for me to recharge and properly clear my head.
Hello, I'm Maddie from Wales, and I like to unplug by doing art if I'm by myself. I always find it's a really great way to distract me and switch off and really get me in the zone. And socially, I love hanging out with my friends, and that's always a great, proper switch off and quality time.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are listening from. My name's Andy. I'm from the southeast. I just moved in with my lovely partner, and this is my entry for how to unplug and unwind. So the gym, love going to the gym. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I go every day because I don't, but that's such a good way to, get my head in the right space. And cooking. Love cooking for my partner. Moved in a few weeks ago, so it's just such a nice way to, I work from home, so when she gets home from a hard day's work, have a lovely meal ready for us and catch up about how her day was, and it's such a beautiful thing to be able to do. So that's such a nice way for me to unwind. That is my entry for how to unplug. Thank you. Over and out.
So, if you're looking to unplug, whether for a moment or a weekend, here are a few things you can try. Number 1, grayscale your phone. Taking color out of the equation makes apps less enticing and more intentional. This trick, recommended in several articles, interrupts automatic swiping and doom scrolling. Number 2, delete and reinstall your apps. Personally, I delete Instagram and Gmail during the week. And when I want to use them, I re-download them for a short burst, then delete them again. Number 3, turn off all notifications. A small change with a huge impact. You decide when to engage, not the other way around. And number 4, create tech-free zones. Make your bedroom a screen-free space. Or start to foster phone independence by leaving it at home when you go for a walk or to the gym. Once you've unplugged from the outside world, it might be time to plug in to yourself. Oh, look at the timing of that. You know what that means. Let's wander over to Battersea Park, not far from the pagoda, and see what we have this week for Archie's Neuro Nuggets. Quick, actionable insights inspired by the emerging field of neuroaesthetics.
Hello, Big Smoke listeners. My name is Archie McAlpine. I am an interdisciplinary specialist in the wellbeing space. I studied biomedical science and then a master's in neuroaesthetics, the newest branch of neuroscience, which explores how our brains respond to the arts and to our environments. So this week we're going to talk about interoception, the science of feeling your body. Here's a concept. Interoception is your brain's ability to sense what's happening on the inside of your body, like your heartbeat or hunger signals. So how does it work? It helps regulate emotions, stress, and intuition. A small area towards the back of your brain, called the anterior insula, lights up and is responsible for this process. Interoceptive dysfunction is commonly associated with mental health conditions like anxiety and depression, and this is because the communication between our brains and bodies is disconnected. Interoception gives the considered quite fluffy term, the mind-body connection, a scientific backbone. It actually does exist, and it is essential for maintaining good mental health. So if you want to explore this a little bit further, close your eyes and try to feel your heartbeat. Take slow, deep breaths and notice body sensations. You could also try practices like yoga, running, cold exposure, or plunge pools, weights training, anything which really requires you to focus on the internal sensations in your body.
Thanks for that, Archie. With that new awareness in place, why don't we head back to our stage and raise the curtain on our next guest? Now, she appeared on our show earlier this year, sharing her beautiful poetry. Please welcome back Nehassaiu deGannes. Welcome back, Nehassaiu. So good to see you again.
Well, thank you for having me again. Such a pleasure to be here amongst the Big Smoke family with a few more poems to share. This poem is One Fine Philadelphia Morning. Traveling to another point in my particular Black diaspora geography or geology or biomythography, to borrow a term from the renowned poet Audre Lorde. We find ourselves in Philadelphia, and I'll talk a little bit about the form afterwards. And this poem is rooted in a lived experience. One fine Philadelphia morning. In a mansion on Walnut, our black heroine awakes. Our black heroine awakes, knowing she's alone, sleeps more. Knowing she's alone, ignores the antique doorbell ringing in a mansion on Walnut. The antique doorbell's ringing, the downstairs phone's eruptions, the downstairs phone's disruptions do not disturb our heroine. Our heroine is not perturbed, friendless in this new city. The antique doorbell ceases. Friendless in this new city, the staircase sighs, a door creaks. The staircase sighs, a door creaks. Arthritic trick of the wind? Just the wind's arthritic tricks? Our heroine sighs, hello? Friendless in this new city. Our heroine rises, hello, peers down the railings cascade, peering down the dark cascade, sees the thief. She's not alone. Does the man see her? She's stone. His back to her, he tiptoes. Our heroine stifles help. His back to her, he tiptoes. Down, down with a small black case. Down, down with a small black case. Dispatcher picks up. Whisper. Dispatcher picks up. Whisper. Ma'am, speak up. I can't hear you. Ma'am, speak up. I can't hear you. Is the suspect a black male? His back to her. She tiptoes. Is the suspect a black male? Dispatches. Old souls dusting. Old black souls dusting the rails of her grad school studio. In her grad school studio, Du Bois and Ellison march. Is the suspect a black male? Du Bois and Ellison watch. The phone, a cop's loaded gun. A cop's loaded gun, her phone. Yes, he's black. Her tears are black. Yes, he's black. Her tears are black. Aren't all our heroines brothers? Du Bois's and Ellison's march. So one might say it takes a village to make a poem. So I lived through that experience living in Germantown, Philadelphia, while at grad school. And it was several years before it made its way to a poem. And I had been working on several drafts of that poem and couldn't quite find the form. I had the privilege of studying poetry with the renowned Black poet Sonia Sanchez while in Philadelphia, in fact. And she taught us form. One of her teachers, Louise Bogan, had also taught Elizabeth Bishop. And it was with Sonia Sanchez that I first tried my hand at a villanelle, first tried my hand at a sestina, and so on. And her mantra was that all poems have form, even free verse has form. And she taught us to listen to the poem because the poem would announce its own form. And so I was working on this poem about this event that I had lived through of encountering a thief who did not see me, hiding in a closet, calling the police. And the first thing the police asked me was the suspect a black male? And working on several drafts, I found my way to the Soul Mountain Writers Retreat, hosted by Marilyn Nelson, who also works in form, a poetic hero of mine. And I love to write in kitchens. And so I was at this writing retreat in Connecticut, in a kitchen. And at that time, all the poets in residence at the time were all black women. And I shared a draft with some of my fellow poets. And they said, oh, do you know Kate Russian's form, A Crown of Sevens? And I said, no, because I knew this poem sort of had a novelistic sense to it, but I wanted it to be poetic and not prose. And they introduced me to Kate Russian's form, A Crown of Sevens, and boom, the poem came into being. So One Fine Philadelphia Morning is a crown of sevens with a flaw. And if you have the opportunity to pick up a copy of my book, Music for Exile, you may discover the flaw. Next, I will share with you, this poem comes from a series, Undressing the River. These will be invented forms or free forms, but I'm playing a little bit with the sense of undressing, as in to redress, as in to address. What does it mean to undress when we are addressing, redressing colonial history? And this poem is rooted in one of my family's home islands in the Caribbean. That island is Dominica. Undressing the river. Slow, salt-fired. Abandon the beach, that oppositional miracle of hot black sand, the volcano's sputum of sparkling shit, to the cruise ship. Pick your way. Rewind music to its source, what the trees drop, mountain kaizo, mango, copra, banana dung, your feet could stagger through and get caught, be stuck here forever. 2 nodes on the island's primordial web. Spot her? The cow, tamarind brown, horns. She spots you. Grow very still. It is said Columbus's men from their vantage lost at sea took one look and declared Waktukabuli a crumpled heap of paper, clutch a sheaf of land, squish it into one's fist, then toss it on a seafaring table. Et voila, the impasse, Dominica. Leave the riverbank to her, the logos of what trembles underfoot. Not the gutted estates, not the airport tarmac stocked for export, not the wait for IMF and EU subsidies. Step back into the river, back onto the rocks, some jagged as the day the volcano dropped 'em, and walk. And this next is the third poem in that series. And so in Dominica, there is a river called Canefield River. I'm sure you can imagine the origins of that particular name. And the beaches in Dominica are, in fact, black volcanic sand. So not what you see in the tourist ads for the Caribbean, in which white sand is the virtue. These are black sand beaches. And after bathing in the salt water of the Caribbean Sea, there is a ritual where then one walks up Canefield River, which is a fresh water river, because Dominica also boasts the world's second largest boiling lake after New Zealand, as well as a freshwater lake up in the mountains. And so then one walks up these freshwater rivers to rinse off the salt water from one's sea bath. Undressing the river 3. And we walk, as if from the long horn, the rattle gourd, the carnival of memory, a two-girl crowd jostling the jagged slope, towels drunk about our hips like batik skirts, festoon our buttocks, boasting a riotous hibiscus trumpeter's chorus. Come, cousin, let us imitate the cow's knowing walk, her basso profundo figure 8s, sly feet liberated from, but still an homage to, the chained samba's staggering ship's sway, and in homage to our Kalinago kin, water-wise, who knew how to transform with fire tree into boat and rode the salt off Wachakabuli's volcanic coast, long before Yamaya drowned here, long before Obatala was dragged here, so home extended beyond the black ribboned hem of our tall mother's skirt, to include Kalinago villages on Guadeloupe, Martinique, St. Lucia, now Creole names all. Condé's home, Césaire's home, Walcott's home. Look, cousin, we are cousin to this all. Come, let we brave Canefield River's uphill course, its anvil of wince and sting, our 4 feet, stunned novitiates, toughening, tougher, getting stronger to find the place where the red rock promises a pool deep enough and wide enough to let one's body in.
And that was Nehassaiu deGannes. You can find a link to her book of poetry, Music for Exile, in the show notes. It's time to reveal the maple leaf. Was it the Roomba on ice? A patriotic push for A? Or the beer crate built for a presidency? The real Canadian headline was... Moosehead's crate of 1,461 beers, one a day for Trump's term, sells out within days. In the CBC News clip, Moosehead Director of Marketing Karen Grigg says the presidential pack was marketed as enough beer to make it through the Trump presidency. But she's hearing that most buyers are planning epic Canada Day celebrations. And there's now a waiting list for the pack. When you buy the crate, there's a message on the side which reads, "Congratulations, you are now 1,461 beers closer to 2029. We can't predict how the next 4 years will go, but considering how 2025 started, we have a feeling this many beers will come in handy." You can find out more in the full news clip from the link in our show notes. Well, that's our show. Thanks for tuning in to The Big Smoke. Whether today got you questioning how some lines were drawn, breathing a little deeper, or just chuckling at your own screen habits, we're glad you were here. If you like what you heard, share this episode with a friend. Or we'd love for you to leave us a review on your podcast app of choice. Until next time, friends, we'll see you soon in The Big Smoke.